Hi there, and welcome to episode 2 of Published by Greenleaf Book Group. My name is Tanya Hall, and today I'll be speaking with Dan Gerstein of Gotham Ghostwriters about the process of working with a ghostwriter.
Welcome to Published, a podcast by Greenleaf Book Group, where we'll discuss the ins and outs of the publishing industry, from writing a book and finding the right publisher, to gearing up for a book launch. And now, here's your host, Greenleaf Book Group CEO, Tanya Hall.
Welcome back to the podcast, and thanks so much for joining us for episode 2. In the last episode, we talked a lot about getting rid of fear and starting to work on writing a manuscript yourself, but for some people, that's not an option, whether they just don't have the time or the ability to sit down and write. For others, ghostwriting can be a saving grace. So today we'll talk about all things ghostwriting. We'll start off talking about what it is, and later in the show we'll get into some of the particulars of how the author and ghostwriter relationship works. So to that end, today I'm joined by Dan Gerstein of Gotham Ghostwriters. Dan is nationally recognized political writer, communication strategist, and idea man who's been writing professionally for himself and others for 25 years. Since forming Gotham Ghostwriters, Dan has become one of the country's top experts on the ghostwriting market and a sought-after source for industry conferences and news articles. He's also a nationally recognized leader in the speechwriting field, co-founding the Professional Speechwriters Association. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So right off the bat, I guess the first question, I'm sure lots of people, when they hear what you do for a living, will ask you, well, what is ghostwriting? How do you define that?
Well, the traditional definition of ghostwriting has mostly pertained to books, and it's the act of one writer writing in the name of another person. But for our purposes, and I think the way that the professional writing market is evolving, ghostwriting is an umbrella term that applies to pretty much any kind of content creation where you're getting hired to write for another person, another organization, another business. And so we use it to cover speech writing. We use it to cover thought leadership, content creation, even copywriting could be described as ghostwriting. Any kind of writing where it's writing for hire, where you're getting hired for your expertise, your skills to create content that won't necessarily be under your byline.
Okay, good. So I think you just pretty much ran through what the typical responsibilities are. Is there anything you would add to that in terms of, is there a line that's drawn anywhere about what a ghostwriter does and does not do?
Well, it's funny. In technical terms, the ghostwriter's main responsibility is to create the content. But beyond that, the responsibilities vary widely depending on the kind of work the writer is doing, and particularly the kind of client they're working with. For when you're ghostwriting books, as you well know, it's a very intimate relationship. Particularly if you're working with an author on a memoir, they're sharing their life story, a lot of the ups and downs of their family, their work, and the ghostwriter, as they go along this journey, often is playing the role of therapist and to some degree diplomat, because if you're doing a lot of interviews and you're talking with someone's family, you have to navigate a lot of different relationships and tensions that go along with those relationships. So, you talk to a lot of professional ghostwriters and they say writing is actually only one part of their job description. A lot of it is counseling the client, the author, navigating different relationships, like I said, playing therapist, and more often than not, being really a partner in the venture. Because a lot of authors, once they develop the relationship and trust with their ghostwriter, they don't purely view them as a ghostwriter. They view them as a collaborator and someone who's going to be working with them to create a book that they're proud to put their name on.
Yeah, well said. I agree. I think there's a certain almost sensitivity that is required of a ghostwriter as they're navigating what is really some, like you said, very personal discovery that has to happen around that writer's background and their voice and their preferences. So I can see where that's a special skill set for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of times authors will come to me and they're quite confused about, well, do I need, what's the vernacular? Do I need a ghostwriter? Do I need an editor? Do I need a writing coach? Can you help put a little bit of clarity around those different functions?
Sure. So I'll start at the beginning of the process and take it all the way through to the end. So there's a universe of authors who very much know what they want to write about, the framework for the book, and just like you said at the top of the show, the thing that holds them back is either they're not good writers themselves or they don't have the time to do it themselves. So they want to engage someone to kind of take the blueprint they've developed and run with it, and in essence, write chapters and create the story against that narrative arc and the framework that the authors already come up with. But then there's another universe of authors who really need help at the beginning of the process, shaping the concept of the book and the flow and structure. And in those cases, sometimes the ghostwriter they hire, again, will be their intellectual partner in helping them figure out the frame of the book, the narrative arc, and in shorthand we will say the hook of the book. Like, what's this book about that you can that you can say in the elevator pitch. In some cases, though, some of the clients we work with will really want to work with someone who has expertise in that particular area, and in some cases, the ghostwriter is the wrong person to play that role as conceptualizer in chief. And so there's a universe of very skilled editors, many of them who've worked at formerly at major publishing houses, who are now on their own as independent consultants, who play that role as what I call as editorial strategists, and helping people figure out what's the path they want for their book, what's the concept, what's the hook, and then create the blueprint that then a ghostwriter can execute against.
Okay, yeah, more like making a map for it.
Exactly. And then at the end of the process, there's certain authors who have written a first draft themselves, and they recognize, though, that it's rough and it really needs help. And so there's another universe of editorial pros who specialize in what's called book doctoring and taking existing manuscripts, restructuring it, refining it, and making it into a more finished product.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Thank you. So in terms of the ethics around using a ghostwriter, that is probably the second question I get after what exactly is it, how does it work? Is it okay? Or I think there's some level of stigma within certain circles. So what are any ethical concerns around using a ghostwriter, and what's your take on that? I'm sure you get asked the same question all the time.
Sure. The short answer, there really is nothing unethical at all at working with a collaborator to help you write a book or any other piece of content. The idea of the author as auteur is actually a very modern convention. It's only been around for a short period of time. For most of human history, storytelling has been a collaborative effort. You could think about the first big book that was ghostwritten was the Bible. We'll leave out the Holy Ghost part of it.
That sold a few copies.
And so there's a long history of authors working with, whether it's an editor, a writing partner, in creating books. So I don't think any chief executive or consultant or tech entrepreneur or head of an advocacy organization, this whole universe of thought leadership, should hesitate at all about employing a writing partner or an editor to help them create the book. Because at the end of the day, it's their ideas, it's their voice that's going to be represented, and most importantly, it's their name that's going to be on the book, and they'll take ownership of it. The only exception to that, and I think where some people get in trouble, is where you have authors that engaged a ghostwriter or a collaborator to work with them and then claim that they wrote the book all by themselves. Then you are absolutely misrepresenting what you contributed to the project, unnecessarily so, because I think now in the age of the internet and how everything is so transparent, I don't think anyone expects the President of the United States to write his own speeches, or that Jack Welch, when he was CEO of GE, writing his own books. These are busy, very important people, and they have staff and advisors and consultants who help them in doing lots of different kinds of work. So it's no surprise to people that they'd hire a writer to work with them in creating the content. Again, a lot of it around ethics just comes down to expectations. So in the case where, there's a logical expectation that someone potentially could use a writer or an editor, there's no issue with it. Where you run into problems is when you mislead people and you misrepresent what you did on the book.
Well, that makes sense. And I think that actually segues really nicely into my next question. So it feels like a little bit of a sort of chicken and the egg thing when you think about finding a ghostwriter, because in theory, they're somewhat invisible, not getting any credit, but in practice, I know that is not necessarily the case. So can you talk, I guess, is there some sort of code for when a book has a ghostwriter, whether that's written with or whatever, however that might be termed? And then obviously going to Gotham Ghostwriters would be a great first place to start, but how do authors go about finding ghostwriters?
Great question. So before the internet in particular, the main way that people could find a writing partner was just asking someone who either had some connection to publishing or was maybe a journalist and knew writers. And we call it the phone a friend strategy. Once the internet really took off and, this became a searchable skill that you could find on Google, more and more of what people have been doing is using Google and other and when LinkedIn and other online resources to identify potential writing partners. One of the reasons I started Gotham Ghostwriters was because people were coming to me and asking me for help in finding speechwriters and other kinds of writers, or whether I would do it myself. And it really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that this is a really hard service to track down, and there's a lot of risk involved when you're hiring a freelancer just based on their website. So we set up Gotham Ghostwriters to be a solution to that problem so that people could get access to very specialized, credible, reliable, professional writers. And then what our agency does that on top of that is, give some critical thinking to who's going to be the right match, so that we're taking a lot of the headache out of the search process and a lot of the risk out of the hiring process. That said, there are other ways that people can find a writing partner. One is, and it's kind of a similar strategy for finding an agent that I'm sure you've advised people, is you look in the acknowledgement section of a book or a series of books that you really like the writing style, and more often than not, if the author used a ghostwriter or collaborator, they'll be mentioned in the acknowledgement section. There'll be a thank you to them. And I actually think that's a better way to identify a potential partner than just scouring the internet, because it's tied to an actual body of work that is good and is probably in the same genre as your book.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's a good tip. So if somebody does call you to query whether or not that might be a fit, what are the types of questions that an author should be asking to investigate that ghostwriting fit?
Great question. So the first thing we tell people is you want to know what kind of experience the writer brings to the project. Have they written similar books? And particularly, have they written similar books with more often than not, the clients are coming to us are first-time authors. So if you are a first-time author, you really want to ideally work with a ghostwriter who has experience working with other first-time authors and is used to kind of helping nurture them through the process. Because writing a book, as you well know, can be very intimidating, even if you're working with a professional ghostwriter. And having someone who is experienced, understands the challenges and stresses of writing your first book is a real advantage. Then the second question to ask is how they would approach your particular project and what their work style typically is. Because one thing you want to avoid is someone who has a very rigid, this is how I do it. And the opposite is, and the better indicator is if they turn around and sort of say, well, I'm used to working in different ways depending on the way the author wants to work, and I'm very flexible. So if they turn around the question and ask you, sort of like, well, how would you want to approach it? What do you think the challenges you'll face in doing this? Then you have someone who is going to be a good partner because they're going to take your lead in adapting their work style to fit yours.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to circle back to something you said to answer the first part of that question. You talked a bit about the other projects that the ghostwriter had worked on in the past. So will the prospective author be able to actually see the names of those projects, or is that all protected and can never be disclosed? Take it to your grave kind of secret.
Yeah. Well, the reality is these days, in most cases, ghostwriters are allowed to list their professional credits on their resume. And that's something that we fight strongly for when we're negotiating projects on the behalf of our writers and contracts, is that, a writer really needs to be able to kind of list their credits and credentials to get future work. And by denying them that ability, you're really hurting their career, their professional standing. And it's often just unnecessary, given that in most cases, like I said, there really is no ethical problem with using a ghostwriter, or our books looked down upon when it's known that the author worked with a collaborator. But in most cases, the exception to that is on celebrity projects. I don't know if it's driven primarily by the celebrities, their managers, or their literary agents, but more often than not, if there's an NDA involved, it's with a very public figure, and oftentimes ghostwriters have to make a judgment call about whether the project's worth it enough to them that they're willing to do it and not be able to list it as a credit on their resume. The way around that problem, though, is in addition to being able to list some of the work you've done where there's no contractual prohibition, what a lot of writers can do is sketch out the type of book they've done. So, it was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and it was a book on business leadership. Because for a lot of clients, the name that's attached with it is less important than the kind of work you did and the caliber of work you did. So by being able to kind of give some context to the work you did without actually disclosing the identity of the author, often serves the same purpose.
Okay. So you gave us some good pointers on what to look for to determine the right fit. What about red flags to watch out for in terms of avoiding a problematic ghostwriter? Can you walk us through some of those?
Sure. So I forgot to mention the obvious thing and it's one of the first questions we get asked, is about cost, right? So it's important to be clear from the author's standpoint about your priorities in terms of choosing a collaborator, and meaning, how important is the credentials they have? Have they written New York Times bestsellers? Have they worked with public figures? And then secondly, balancing that against your own budget and what you're willing to invest in hiring a collaborator. Where we've seen things go sour and where the problems arise is when that discussion gets punted, or there's a misunderstanding and miscommunication. And then at the end of the process, the ghostwriter makes a fee proposal and the author is really taken aback, or saying, I can't afford that, or that's outrageous. So having that kind of conversation up front, not necessarily, negotiating up front, but having an understanding of the fee range that the ghostwriter typically has charged for comparable projects in the past, I think reduces the likelihood you're going to have misunderstandings or waste your time up front, and so that you're in the right zone.
Okay. Speaking of that zone, I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, as do I. What does it cost to do a book or ghostwrite a book? And I always tell people, that it never intended to be an evasive answer, but it's a complicated question because there's lots of variables. But just ballpark, could you kind of give us a feel for what it might cost? And let's say that it's a nonfiction work, roughly 200 pages. What are we looking at in terms of costs?
Sure. And just like you pointed out, there are a lot of factors that go into evaluating the cost. And I think another issue that complicates matters is that the market is very opaque. There's not a lot of discussion. It's a hidden art, and it's not very standardized as a result of that. So it's hard for authors even to have any kind of context or benchmarking other than to talk to a number of ghostwriters and get quotes from them, and then you can have a sense of the market that way. I would say the range is on the low end, $20,000 to $25,000 to write that kind of book, where you're writing it from scratch, all the way up to the mid six figures. The bulk of the business books that we're pairing ghostwriters with are in the $50,000 to $75,000 range, and I think that is if you're setting expectations, is a good range to be thinking about to hire an accomplished professional ghostwriter who's worked on business books that have been published by legitimate business book publishers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in terms of the variables that can tip it one way or the other, is that primarily the ghostwriter's resume, or is it more the complexity of the content? What can make it more expensive or less expensive?
You just hit on the two primary factors, which is the scope of work and the complexity of the subject matter. A big driver is whether there's going to be primary research, right? So if the ghostwriter is expected to go out and do a bunch of interviews in addition to interviewing the author to support his arguments and provide data, that will add to the cost. The ghostwriter's credentials and what they can command on the open market is also the second primary driver of the cost. A third potential driver is whether there's a crash deadline, right? So say an author gets a publishing deal, or they're using a custom publisher like Greenleaf to crash out a book in advance of a major conference, or to be able to be ready for a speaking tour. In cases like that, if it's say you have a 3-month sprint to get a book done and the ghostwriter is going to be working full time, that limits and maybe even excludes their ability to do other work, and that will get factored into the cost.
Sure. And how is that typically structured? Is it a flat lump sum fee, or do the ghostwriters take a royalty, a little bit of both? What's a typical deal and what's a good deal?
It's a mix. I would say a lot of it depends on the context and the nature of the publishing agreement. But I would say the overwhelming majority of the projects where we're placing writers on, the writers paid a flat fee. And that's negotiated ahead of time, and they'll be paid often either half up front and half on completion, or in thirds or quarters. And in the middle 1 or 2 payments are tied to meeting certain benchmarks, so delivering half the chapter drafts, or maybe finishing an outline would be the trigger for the second payment. Then there's a case if you're starting from scratch and you're trying to traditionally publish, and as you know, you got to write a proposal, that will be the first part of the fee that gets negotiated and paid to write the proposal. And then in some cases, you'll pre-negotiate the terms for writing the full manuscript with the proviso that the author is obligated to pay that only if the book sells and they move forward with the project. But in some cases, the author will just want to negotiate to hire the writer to do the proposal and take a wait-and-see approach until they understand what the publishing options they have are. And then they can make an informed decision about how much to pay the writer based on what kind of advance they get, for example.
That's smart. Okay, so what about ownership? So are these all structured as work for hires, or is there ever a case where there's sort of mutual ownership of the content?
Yes. So I would say the overwhelming majority of the cases, it is work for hire. The writer is getting hired by the author to help them create the product, but the author maintains total control of the intellectual property and ownership. The exceptions to that are where the collaborator is a true collaborator, and they're going to be most likely listed as a co-author on the cover, and there will be a split of the advance in royalties. Sometimes that happens because the author has limited budget themselves. They don't have the money available to pay the writer at the rate that the writer would want to get paid. So in exchange for taking a little risk and putting a little skin in the game, the author will share share some of the upside with the writer, where they'll get a percentage of the advance that the publisher pays, and then advance of royalties if the book earns back the advance. And that's anywhere in the range of 30 to 50% would be the writer's share.
Wow. I must say that's steeper than I expected.
Well,
but well earned.
Yeah. Well, oftentimes, again, it's a reward to the writer for contributing to the success of the project and for the fact that they're taking some risk. Because if the advance is $10,000, then the writer is going to get substantially underpaid.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So in terms of the actual working relationship, I think some people are surprised at times that they still have to make a time commitment when working with a ghostwriter. They don't just, magically hire someone and they turn around and boom, there's a book. So can you talk about how much involvement a ghostwriter would expect from an author and what an author in turn should expect to be able to provide to their author throughout the project?
It's a really important question, and it's one that for there to be a successful relationship and a successful collaboration, that has to be negotiated and agreed upon right at the beginning. And that's why in our agreements, we usually will specify that the first deliverable that the ghostwriter has to come up with is a work plan that sketches out a schedule for the production of the book and a division of labor. So it's clear who's responsible for what, and then the time frame for meeting those commitments. And having that clarity of expectations up front really it increases the likelihood that you're not going to have misunderstandings. There'll be fewer missed deadlines, and the author will know what their time commitment is ahead of time. How much time the author puts in, to some degree, is driven by how involved they actually want to be in the production. What I typically tell people is the more involved they are, the more likely that the book is going to reflect their voice, their values, their priorities, and be the book that they're comfortable representing their life's work, their life story out there. So there's really a very large incentive for authors to make themselves available, particularly in the front end, to give the ghostwriter access to them so that they can capture their voice. They understand what the author wants to communicate in the book. And by investing that block of time up front, oftentimes it means that the author will have to spend less time throughout the chapter production process.
Sure. So if you're talking to Joe, busy CEO, or Josephine, busy CEO, and this person is considering writing a book, considering working with a ghostwriter, again, going back to the kind of ballpark range, what's a fair request in terms of them blocking out X amount of time?
Well, I would say, they should expect to invest somewhere in the range, I would say, of 10 to 20 hours of talking time at the beginning of the process. Part of that is the brainstorming and the conceptualization of the book. Part of it's talking through the process for producing drafts, editing, things like that. And part of it is really just allowing the writer entree into the author's head and life so that they get a good sense of what this person's about, what makes them tick, and their voice. Again, like one of the most important things in the success of collaboration is the trust level that between the author and the writer. And a lot of that trust is around issues of voice. And one of the biggest problems that we get called in to troubleshoot at the beginning of a collaboration is when the author feels like the writer's just not getting it, just not being able to write in his voice. And so to avoid that, again, I think that the most important investment is the quality of time up front, which pays dividends down the line. And then I think after that upfront process, I think that the most important thing is not necessarily the quantity of time, but the regular access that the ghostwriter will have as they're producing chapter drafts and then getting feedback. So what I'm a big fan of is scheduling regular check-in calls throughout the drafting process, and then particularly scheduling review calls after a writer submitted either a chapter or, say, a package of chapters. So that it's understood that the author's going to make time to give them direct feedback so that they can then revise those chapters so they're more in line with what the author wants.
So, Dan, I have certain authors who have been in what we call here project development for 2-3 years, and I have others who move through it in 4 to 5 months. So we kind of know what a typical start to finish time frame is, with, again, the caveat that we have folks who fall on either end. What would you say is a typical start to end timeline for working with a ghostwriter if the author does give the access that you just described?
I would say it's usually in the range of about 4 to 8 months. The exception to that norm is usually one of two things. Either there is a life event or a professional event that in the author's life that interrupts their ability to devote time and often mental energy to the project. And then the second thing is, sometimes happen is the author will second guess the focus of the book, or their professional circumstance change, and therefore the needs of the book might change as well. And those kinds of evolutions will also prolong the time horizon. But like I said, most of the projects where we're placing writers with, they fall pretty comfortably in that 4 to 8 month range.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So when you get into some of those situations like you just described, where maybe the author takes a right turn on the content, or just in general, for some reason, the author isn't happy with the ghostwriter, whether they're not hitting the deadlines or they feel like the voice isn't just right, what sort of recourse do they have? How do you go about troubleshooting those scenarios?
Well, at the beginning of the process, it's very important to have a termination provision in the contract, right? So that, and that's what contracts are for, to anticipate worst case scenarios and provide guardrails. So having it be understood on both sides and having a fair and balanced termination provision that anticipates the possibility that through no fault of the ghostwriter, that the relationship isn't clicking, because it is such a subjective thing. And the quality of the writer's work, to a large degree, is in the eye of the beholder, in this case, the author. So they're not like objective benchmarks and metrics to measure the writer's work. And so in cases like that, there needs to be some kind of exit provision that allows the author to terminate the relationship because it's just not working. That said, there also is a vested interest on both parties to make the relationship work, particularly once you're past that initial prep phase, where we say you're working on the conceptualization or the outline. And so often the posture we'll take is we'll try and do some troubleshooting to see if we can preserve the relationship, because there's a major sunk cost on the part of the author, not just financially, but emotionally, in building the relationship with the writer. And you don't want to necessarily give up on that, and the knowledge the writer has about your life, your work, as well as how you work. That's something of value that you don't want to fritter away, because with a new writer, you have to start that all over from scratch. So we'll try and make sure we can open communications, flush out to the surface what the issues are, and see if they're solvable. And what you find sometimes is, and I would say this is the most common point of breakdown between the author and the ghostwriter, is the author doesn't communicate clearly when they're unsatisfied with the work product. They don't want to hurt the writer's feelings, or they don't necessarily know how to communicate it to it, so they keep it to themselves. And then it boils over. And this is one of the ways that the ghostwriting relationship is very much like a romantic relationship. It's like a marriage. A lot of times spouses will keep grievances to themselves, and then they'll build up, and then it bursts out into the open very late in the game, and I want a divorce. And sometimes divorce is unavoidable, but in some cases, if those grievances, those problems were aired early on, they're often fixable. So that's one of the things that we try and encourage the authors to do, is to not hold back, because the writer can't satisfy them, can't do their job if the author is not communicating to them where they're missing the mark.
Seems very reasonable. Okay, well, gosh, you've given us so much great information about working with ghostwriters. This has been great. Is there anything else that you think a would-be author considering using a ghostwriter should know?
Related to what I just said, I think one of the most important things is to understand that mastering someone else's voice, even the best ghostwriters, it takes some time. It takes access and time. And so it's important to give them the space to make mistakes at the beginning of the process. And then, like I said, share with them your feedback, because it's not criticism. It's guidance, and it's helping the writer do their job and helping them produce something that you're going to be happy with. And to be clear that, I wouldn't use that word, or that doesn't sound like me, or I'd prefer to use this story, right? That will be welcome for most professional ghostwriters, because it will mean that they're going to get closer to the mark faster in the process.
I think that's an excellent point, to give constructive feedback versus the "I don't know, I just don't like it" feedback.
Right, exactly. If you boil it down, speak early and be specific.
Well said. Okay, good. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. We appreciate your time.
I appreciate you having me, and I hope I've helped some people.
I'm sure you have. For more information and resources, check out greenleafbookgroup.com/episode2, numeric 2. So greenleafbookgroup.com/episode2. And to learn more about Dan and his company, Gotham Ghostwriters, you can visit gothamghostwriters.com. Next up, we'll be switching gears to talk about author branding. We hope you'll join us there.
Thanks for listening to Published. To learn more, please visit greenleafbookgroup.com. And remember to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.